We all remember where we were last year, September the 18th, when we heard the news that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died at the age of 87. She had come to be known as the iconic, the notorious RBG. Ginsburg was appointed by President Bill Clinton in 1993 and became a pioneer for women's rights, voting rights, and immigrant rights. Be that as it may, she wore her robe of justice, perhaps far longer than what would have benefited the liberal cause. In 2014, when Ginsburg was 81 years old, calls grew for her to retire in an effort to ensure a Democratic president, who was, of course, President Obama at the time, that a Democratic president would be able to appoint her successor. Obama tried to get her to stand down too. She refused, and we all know what happened after that. Trump took office in 2017, and less than 4 years later, after Ginsburg's death, he pushed through her replacement on the court, right-winger Amy Coney Barrett, whose views contradict the late justices in nearly every possible way. So, shouldn't this serve as a cautionary tale for Justice Stephen Breyer, who is 82 years old? He served on the court for nearly 30 years, and again, to ensure a Democratic president replaces him, people are calling on him to retire ASAP. But he's not interested. In his new book, titled The Authority of the Court and the Peril of Politics, he writes, a judge's loyalty is to the rule of law, not the political party that helped to secure his or her appointment. Yeah, that's great in theory, but nonsense in the real world, where he knows full well there is a very real 6-3 conservative majority on his bench. And so if Democrats can't balance that out now, and if a Republican ends up replacing Breyer and giving us a 7-2 conservative court, then the country is really screwed. Some of the high-stakes Supreme Court cases happening right now include whether Obamacare will be struck down, leaving up to 20 million Americans without medical insurance. Another major case is one that pits religious rights against LGBTQ rights. The justices will weigh Philadelphia's refusal to allow a Catholic Church-affiliated group to participate in the city's foster care program because it would not accept same-sex couples as prospective foster parents. The court is also preparing to rule in a case concerning Arizona voting rights. Republican proponents of the restrictions there cite the need to combat voting fraud. The ruling may determine what happens to the new wave of voting restrictions in Georgia, Florida, and elsewhere. Remember, Justice Breyer is one of three liberal justices left on the court. During his lecture at Harvard Law School recently, he warned, if the public sees judges as politicians in robes, its confidence in the courts and in the rule of law itself can only diminish, diminishing the court's power, including its power to act as a check on other branches. Seriously? It's hard to pick which words in that statement I find to be the most naive, or the most misguided, or the most self-serving. A politicized Supreme Court? That ship has sailed, Justice Breyer. Our next guest perhaps said it best. What the hell is Justice Breyer thinking? In his op-ed for Vox, Ian Millhiser writes, Justice Breyer's new warning for Democrats couldn't have come at a worse time. American democracy is in crisis. Breyer thinks now's the time to scold his fellow liberals. Here to discuss is Ian Millhiser himself, Vox senior correspondent and author of The Agenda, How a Republican Supreme Court is Reshaping America. Ian, thanks for coming back on the show. So let's start with the obvious one. What the hell is Justice Breyer thinking?
I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that question. And I mean, there's still a month left in the term. I hope he realizes that now is the right time for him to retire. And maybe this whole conversation will be unnecessary. But if you read his latest book, it sure doesn't sound like he's thinking that way.
No.
And let me put this in the most charitable way possible to him. I think he believes in protecting institutions. And I think that institutions like a neutral judiciary are very important to a democracy. If you don't have them, you're in serious trouble. The problem is we don't have one, and we're in serious trouble. And, you know, I like to make pretend too. I like to play fantasy sometimes, but I think that Justice Breyer needs to accept that he lives in the world that he does live in. He needs to accept the world that the court has become extraordinarily politicized. And if he wants it to be viewed as less political, I can tell him the worst thing that he can do is to wait and let his seat be filled by a Republican. So now we have a 7-2 court that's going to be even more aggressive in advancing the GOP's agenda.
I mean, I'm not sure how anyone with a brain, let alone a well-regarded, clearly very intelligent, probably more intelligent than you and I, justice on the Supreme Court, can watch the Gorsuch nomination, the Kavanaugh nomination, the Amy Coney Barrett nomination, and think, hey, me staying on till the very end and allowing a Republican to replace me, that won't be political at all. But then he says stuff, Ian, like he said recently, well, you should learn to talk to your Republican friend. That's how you get through to him. As if, you know, the last 10 years just didn't happen. But look, let's put Breyer to one side. You and I, with this discussion, sadly, are not going to persuade him to stand down. But let's talk about the wider liberal movement. Why have liberals, Ian, been so awful at both recognizing the political impact and power of the Supreme Court in particular and the judiciary in general, and getting control of it in the way that conservatives have so relentlessly done?
Yeah, I mean, well, I will tell you, I am uncomfortable with judicial power. Like, I like democracy. I like the idea that we elect our leaders. I like the idea that if our leaders aren't doing a good job, we can elect different people. And so, like, I am uncomfortable with the judiciary wielding so much power. And I think that that is a common sentiment amongst liberals, that, you know, we don't focus on the courts because we think of Congress and the presidency, you know, the elected people in our government, as the appropriate people to set the policy. But, you know, I'll levy the same critique I levied against Justice Breyer, against myself, and against liberals in general. Like, we have to live in the real world. And here in the real world, the court is exercising too much power. It's striking down too many voting rights laws, too many other laws. And that means that liberals, Democrats, you know, people who care about continuing to live in a democracy need to take the court very seriously.
So are they, Ian? Are things changing now? Have people recognized on the left the need to try and balance out what conservatives have done so well via the Federalist Society and via, you know, all sorts of groups and pressure groups over the last couple of decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are starting to get it. I mean, I think that if you look at the polls, they show that more and more Democrats and more liberals are starting to appreciate the danger that the court presents. I think if you look at the backlash, I mean, there's been a tremendous backlash. Breyer hasn't even said yet, I'm not retiring. He's only hinted at it. So, like, you know, if you look at the backlash from liberals in the media, liberals on Twitter, you know, the fact that I'm on your show right now, I think that people to the left are starting to realize, like, this is a serious problem. We need to drill down. You know, I talk to my young lawyer friends, and, like, the people who are just now graduating from law school, they really get it. They really get how much trouble we're in. What my fear is that it might be too late. Because if the Supreme Court starts doing things like striking down the Voting Rights Act or what's left of it, if we start seeing more Bush v. Gore-like decisions, you know, at a certain point, I mean, you've just lost your democracy.
I mean, it's 6-3 right now, regardless of what Breyer does. It's 6-3, which is a pretty healthy conservative majority to get stuff done. It's funny, though, that when some of us criticized Ruth Bader Ginsburg, including after her death, for not having stood down earlier, we were accused of misogyny. Because, well, why didn't you say the same to Stephen Breyer? Well, a lot of us are saying the same to Stephen Breyer right now. Consistency matters. Let me ask you this. Of the big Supreme Court decisions coming up, what's the one you're most concerned about, given the current makeup of this court?
So the one I'm most concerned, it actually isn't the Obamacare case, just because I think that the arguments in that case on the plaintiff's side are too stupid, even for this Supreme Court. The one that concerns me is there's a case called Brnovich. It involves the continued viability of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court could potentially neuter what remains of the Voting Rights Act. I don't think they're going to strike it down in its entirety, but they could potentially make it so weak that it ceases to have any real force. And if you don't have voting rights protections, I mean, we're already seeing what happens. We're seeing it in Georgia. We're seeing it in Texas.
Will a Brnovich decision, this is Brnovich versus the DNC, this voting rights case, if that goes, you know, in the Republicans' favor, in the authoritarian direction, does that neuter the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Not necessarily. I mean, like, I think that whatever decision we're going to get in Brnovich is probably going to be a statutory decision, meaning that it interprets the Voting Rights Act itself, as opposed to a constitutional decision saying that it's unconstitutional. But I do worry that this Supreme Court, if you look at its constitutional, how it interprets the Constitution in the voting rights context, it's so hostile to voting rights that I think that the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act would have a difficult road in front of the Supreme Court if they do become law.
Indeed. One last quick question before I let you go. Joe Biden has formed a commission on whether to expand or reform the Supreme Court to report back, I believe, in 6 months. Do you see that as a real opportunity to make some substantive changes to our ridiculously imbalanced Supreme Court with lifetime appointments and the rest? Or is it just Joe Biden kicking this into the long grass?
Yeah, I mean, I saw this commission as sort of a bone he was throwing to people who want Supreme Court reform. There are a lot of very prominent law professors who have been very outspoken about the need for reform. You know, Dan Epps, Ganesh Sitaraman, Steve Vladeck, people like that. None of them were invited to sit on the commission. Like the people on the commission, it's a very impressive list of scholars, but I didn't see any names on the list who I think of as people who are associated with the cause of court reform. So unfortunately, I mean, maybe things will change if we lose the Voting Rights Act. Maybe that'll light a fire under Democrats. But I'm worried that there are enough Democrats who aren't taking this seriously that we're stuck with the court we have.
Sadly, I have to agree with you. Depressingly, they are not taking it seriously enough. But Ian Millhiser, appreciate you taking it seriously. Appreciate you coming on the show tonight. Thank you. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.